Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Lots of information to cover this morning, and great. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Greenfield. I have been working on web accessibility at UB since 1999. The very first web accessibility policy that came down from the state of New York was called Policy 99.3. And I was actually working for CIT at the time and kind of really embraced the whole concept of accessibility. So I have to say, in the, 19 years now since I've been doing this, this is the largest gathering we have ever had on campus to talk about accessibility. So thank you for coming. So quick overview of what we're going to cover this morning. So really three basic pieces. I do want to spend a few minutes kind of just giving an overview of web accessibility, why it matters perhaps even more than you think. Secondly, I want to spend some time giving an update about where we are with our OCR resolution agreement. I think most of you are aware that we have gone into an agreement with the Office of Civil Rights in terms of making our sites accessible. So I want to bring everybody up to date on what we have done over the past couple of months and kind of the timeline moving forward. Second half today, we're going to get into some basic training on what everybody should be thinking about, really high level, relatively easy things to do around accessibility. And then we will have some time, hopefully at the end, for questions and answers. That being said, if you do have a question as I'm going through, please feel free to ask. I may hold it off till the end. The room, this is scheduled until 10 o'clock. If there is interest to go beyond 10 o'clock, because there's a lot of questions, I'm happy to stay afterwards. So with that, let's get started. So let me give you just a brief overview of web accessibility. This is my favorite definition of web accessibility. It talks about the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites. So this really is about barriers and removing those barriers. My favorite book on web accessibility is called, I have a copy of it here, A Web for Everyone. This is a book that you don't have to be real technical to understand. And what it really does is give you kind of a framework to think about any of the work that you do on the web. And for me, this has always been a natural kind of interaction between, the approach I take on the web, which is all about usability. So there is a huge correlation between accessibility and usability. So for things that we find frustrating as, part of the general population, we may come across something where the web doesn't work the way we expect it to work. For somebody who has a disability, that becomes a barrier where they actually can't make something work. So that's really kind of the relationship between this. And there's always a correlation between, making things working for people with disabilities usually helps everybody. And let me give you a very specific example. My pet peeve on the web right now are autoplay videos. So I don't know how many of you have gone to most of the media sites, whether it's CNN or the Washington Post, whatever it may be, all of a sudden videos start playing. So this typically happens to me when I'm in a very quiet place. And I'm supposed to be really quiet. So this past weekend, I am in Nashville at a volleyball tournament, my wife and daughter in a hotel room. I wake up really early. So I'm up at 4:30 in the morning, and I open up my iPad, where the sound is muted, by the way, and without me doing anything, a video starts playing with the sound on. Now, for me, that's very annoying. But for somebody who is relying on assistive technology, think about this. They need to hear where the controls are to turn that video off. They will never hear that control because the sound from the video is overriding that. So that's a huge, huge barrier. So to me, that's my favorite example of something that where for me it's annoying. For somebody who's relying on assistive technology, it actually is something that prevents them from using that site. There is a misconception, I think, that when we're talking about people with disabilities or talking about web accessibility, we're really talking about people who are blind, when in fact, it is a much, much larger audience than that. Most numbers right now talk about 20%, that 20% of the population have some type of disability that could impact their ability to use the web. So a lot of people, there's a lot of pushback sometimes about making sites accessible because people look at it as a huge expense that really is only impacting a small percentage of people, when in fact it impacts a large percentage of people. So think about that 20%. Also think about the idea of permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities. So if you look in the left column here, permanent disabilities. However, some of us will face temporary disabilities. If you break your wrist and can't use a mouse, you're going to be having the same issues with using a mouse and a keyboard. If you, have an ear infection and can't hear, or laryngitis and can't talk. So temporary disabilities. There are also a number of situational disabilities. It's been interesting as this has become the predominant way to surf the web, all of a sudden the environment becomes a big issue. So we're going to talk a little bit about low vision and the need to have high contrast. This is fine when I'm in here, but as soon as I walk outside in the sunshine and try to look at this screen, I will benefit from having higher contrast because I'll be able to see what I'm looking at. So, keep in your mind that, when you're thinking about accessibility, it actually impacts a pretty significant part of the population. And I'm sure all of us at some point have come in situations where we should be doing this. So another interesting stat for me is that when you think about closed captioning, 80% of the people using closed captioning are not deaf or hard of hearing. So think about if you're out in a bar or you're in a place that you have to be quiet and you want to watch a video, 80% of people, that's kind of the situation that you're in. So when it comes to disabilities, and we're thinking about the web, there are 4 major categories to think about. The first is vision. So this includes blindness, it includes low vision, includes color blindness. In fact, if you remember when the Bills played the Jets back in November of 2016, I think it was, and it was on a Thursday night, and the Bills were in all red and the Jets were in all green. Challenge of that game is the most common form of color blindness is red and green, and people can't differentiate that. In fact, there was a former player from the New York Giants who actually went out online on Twitter and said, "What are you guys doing? I can't see who's who." And you can actually simulate that. If you go and grab a picture from that game, there are some simulators for red-green blindness, color blindness, and you can't tell who's on what team. So this really impacts, so color blindness is something you definitely need to think about. Second is hearing. So this includes both deafness and hard of hearing. This is where adding captions to videos is very important. Adding transcripts to audio is very important. Third category is motor. So thinking about people who can't use their hands. My father suffered a stroke when he was in his mid-50s, and he could not use a mouse. For whatever reason, he was able to use a keyboard fine, but he could not use a mouse. So he became very proficient at using the keyboard to navigate the web. Last category is cognitive. So this is people with learning disabilities, people who are easily distracted, can't focus on things. This might be the largest percentage of the population. The number of people with dyslexia is very large. And if you think about the work we do here at UB, that's really an important thing for us to think about. One of the challenges with cognitive disabilities is it's hard to codify whether a site meets some of those standards or not. So when you look at these standards we're going to talk about in a few minutes, most of that is focused on people who have vision issues or hearing issues. But one of the things I've really been thinking about lately is how do we really look at the cognitive issues and how we can make our sites easier for people to use. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. All right, so that's kind of just my brief overview of accessibility. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the legal landscape and kind of where we are with the Office of Civil Rights. So I always preface my statements in this part of the presentation that I am not a lawyer. So don't take this as any legal advice. That being said, I have done this for a long time and kind of understand some of the nuance about what we're supposed to do. So when it comes to accessibility, there are 2 main pieces of legislation at the federal level that we need to think about. The first is the American with Disabilities Act. Specifically in there, they talk about program access and effective communication. So if an institution is sued under the ADA, those are usually the 2 specific things that they are focused on. In addition to that is Section 508. Most of you who have been doing the web for a while have heard of Section 508. It's always been a little bit confusing because the standards for Section 508 are different than the kind of international standards, and we're going to talk about that just a second. But as of January, this past January, that issue has gone away. So let me talk about that in a second. So there are two main standards we need to think about when it comes to web accessibility. The first is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The kind of acronym for that is WCAG. So the first WCAG was published in 1999, version 1.0. Version 2.0, which is the current version, was published in 2008. There are 3 conformance levels to WCAG 2.0. A is the ones that you definitely have to do. The double A's should do. Triple A, get a little more challenging to implement, and you can do those if you want. Almost all of the guidelines that you see refer to the WCAG 2.0 double A standard. So when you come across that, that's what we need to be paying attention to. Not to make things more complicated, but WCAG 2.1 is coming very shortly. So I expect WCAG 2.1 to be in place as of June of this year. They are adding 20 new performance standards, and they have to do with 3 particular areas. One is the mobile web, because if you look at the data on this, this was put, the WCAG 2.0 standard was written in 2008 before the mobile web was really a thing. So there are 10 new standards that address the mobile web. There are, I believe, 4 standards that address low vision, and there are 6 standards that address cognitive disabilities. So that is not approved yet, but it is 99% of the way there, and my expectation is that we will be, following, that will be the most current standard as of this summertime. With Section 508, there was always a discrepancy between the Section 508 standards and the WCAG 2.0 standards. As of last January, they rectified that, and it's called the Section 508 refresh. What that basically means is that the Section 508 standards now follow the WCAG 2.0 double A standard. Hope I'm not throwing too many acronyms and all that around. But anyways, it's actually going to get simpler because there's not going to be competing standards. So that was put into place as of January of 2017. As of this past January, that's the new Section 508 standard. In the old Section 508, there were 22 success criteria. In the double A standards, there are 38 success criteria. So it's actually more stringent now to follow the Section 508 standards. All right, enough of all of that. One other thing you should be aware of from a legal perspective is that there was a historic case last summertime that had to do with the Winn-Dixie grocery chain. So I've been talking about web accessibility for a long time. In fact, I taught a graduate class in our former School of Informatics on web accessibility. I remember back then, 10 years ago, saying there's no case law. So this really gets tricky in terms of the legal piece of it. This Winn-Dixie case is the first time that at the federal level that a case was actually tried and not settled out of court. And the court found that Winn-Dixie was liable because their site was not accessible. So again, there's a little bit of legal precedent there now. Not to say that there isn't still some interpretation at the federal level about how all of this works, but we're starting to kind of move in that direction. So that's kind of a brief overview of where we are legally. I think it's really good to understand the kind of the legal context of accessibility. So let's move on now and talk about where we are with the resolution agreement with the OCR. So for those of you not familiar with this process and what we've been going through, the Office of Civil Rights is part of the U.S. Department of Education, and they frequently receive complaints related to the web or the accessibility of college and university websites. They also do K through 12 as well, so they're really involved with this kind of on the education front. There are other avenues that you can sue somebody because their site is not accessible, but the main one we deal with are OCR complaints. When I say we, I'm saying in higher education. So one of the challenges that we have faced in the last year is that there are now hundreds of these OCR complaints being filed, most of them coming from a single person. This person has good intentions, however, has really created a lot of, perhaps extra work and kind of diluting the process a little bit because a number of these complaints. The OCR is required to investigate all of these complaints. So we have received a complaint. Virtually every SUNY campus has received an OCR complaint. So we are not alone as we're dealing with this issue. So our complaint we received in the last summertime. We made a good faith effort to bring our sites up to compliance, and unfortunately, mainly given the size and scope of what we do here, we were unable to kind of meet the requirements. So we went into a resolution agreement with the OCR in November of 2017, and that's going to be driving the approach we take to accessibility over the next couple of years. So some of the key points about this OCR agreement. By next week, we need to be submitting to the OCR for its review and approval proposed policies and procedures to ensure that all newly added and modified online content will be accessible. So that is going to the OCR next week. Don't have any reason to think that that won't be approved. What you all need to be thinking about, if you are in the middle of a redesign of a website that is going to launch after February 2015, that website should be accessible. So keep that in the back of your mind. Secondly, by May 15th, we will complete an audit of all of our websites and submit a corrective action plan for OCR approval. So over the next 3 months, myself and a lot of other people are going to go through an audit of our sites, identify the accessibility issues, and develop a corrective action plan. That will be submitted to the OCR on May 15th. Once that is approved, we have 18 months to implement that plan. So for all of you thinking about when we need to make our sites accessible as part of this OCR resolution agreement, right now the target date is November of 2019. As I say that, don't wait till October of 2019 to start thinking about this. For some of us who have been thinking about accessibility right from the start, the remediation is not going to be that difficult. For people who haven't been thinking about this or have sites that are fairly complex, this will take some time to really think about the best way to implement this. Some other actions to date on the OCR front. In December, on the sites in the UBCMS, we added to the footer an accessibility statement, a link that gets you to information about accessibility. If you don't have an accessibility statement on your website in your footer, that is something you should think about adding as soon as you can. And here's the reason why. This is something that the OCR really likes to see because it provides an alternate way to get information. So the analogy is that if you walk into a restaurant, a mom and pop restaurant, and they're changing their menu daily, but they don't have the resources to make a menu in Braille daily, providing an accommodation for them is just to have the wait staff come over and read the menu to them. So the accessibility statement kind of functions the same way. If somebody can't access information on your website and you give them contact information to get the help they need, that is a huge step forward in terms of accommodating those individuals. So think about adding an accessibility link to an accessibility statement, on all of your web pages. We have created a draft web accessibility policy that's been circulating for about the past year or so, and that will be submitted for review next week to the OCR. We have begun to offer training sessions. So last fall and even last summertime, many of you attended some of the DCT training. This is the first session after the resolution agreement was, approved, and there will be many, many more training sessions coming, and I will talk about that in a little while. We have also contracted with a company called SiteImprove to help us with the audit, both as part of the audit process and ongoing. In our office, we have been using SiteImprove for 3.5, 4 years. It is a very powerful tool that lets you crawl your entire website to find not only accessibility issues, but other problems you may have with your site. So for example, it will find spelling errors. It will find broken links. It will find issues around search engine optimization. You can write policies to help you find specific things. So for example, one of the policies we've written in our site, in our implementation of SiteImprove, is to find pages that don't have that accessibility statement. So it's a very powerful tool. We will be implementing this on March 1st is when the contract starts. We have a conversation tomorrow with SiteImprove to talk about how we're going to ramp this up and how we're going to implement it on campus. So stay tuned for more information about that. I do expect we will have a training session in the not-too-distant future specifically on Site Improve, how we're implementing it, and how to use it. So that's really good news. I can't imagine trying to do an audit of buffalo.edu, which my best guess is 1.5 million web pages, without a tool like Site Improve. So that's really good news, and it's going to be really helpful. Finally, there are 2 staff now who are focused on web accessibility on campus. Myself, who is serving as the interim web accessibility officer, and Kim Behan in the back, if you don't know Kim, who is now working as the web accessibility coordinator. So again, as somebody who has been thinking about this at UB for 18 years, it is great to see resources being put toward this. And I think the benefit is going to go way beyond just making sure our sites are accessible, because I think overall the quality of our websites is going to go up tremendously. So let's talk a little bit about the audit itself. We need to complete this by May 15th. There are 2 groups that are in the process of being formed. The first is an audit team. It's going to be about 10 people or so. Many of those people are in this room. This is going to be people who assist us with doing the audit. So these are very technical people. And what we're looking for is really an understanding of what is at buffalo.edu. It's not as simple as having Site Improve crawl it. There's going to be a lot of nuance in terms of what we need to look at, and even understanding what the high traffic pages are and what parts of sites get used the most. So that's the audit team. In addition to that, there's going to be a much larger group of audit liaisons. We're going to be able to need a contact person for virtually UB's entire web presence. So how that kind of plays out, we'll see. But we're going to have some communication in terms of talking with people about specific questions regarding your site. So this is all in the early stages. I expect the audit team to be meeting in the next couple of weeks. We have been waiting a little bit on that Site Improve purchase. Now that we know that's coming, it will help us kind of design the way the audit's going to actually work. So for the audit, the first thing we need to do is a complete inventory of buffalo.edu. That includes third-party software running within buffalo.edu. So a lot of people have asked that question. It also will include some sites that are outside of the buffalo.edu domain. So for example, I was very surprised that when the OCR complaint came in the summertime, they looked at ubbulls.com. And not only ubbulls.com, but the Blue and White Club site as well. Neither of those are buffalo.edu sites, but they are Buffalo UB web properties. So the exact scope of our inventory and what we're going to look at is still to be determined, but if something is in buffalo.edu, there's a pretty good chance we will be looking at it. As part of the audit, again, it will be impossible to audit every single page that we have. So we're going to focus on 2 things. The first is the high traffic student-facing web pages. At the end of the day, that's what we're in business to do. So we're going to look at those pages that are really student-focused. The second is looking at pages that provide essential services to the university, particularly for students. So if you think about the hub, if you think about Blackboard, in fact, traditionally when there have been OCR complaints, it has been for the learning management system, because at the end of the day, that's what we do. So we're going to go through and try to determine, what sites we're going to look at as part of this audit, but those will be the focus. Then we're going to perform the audit itself. It'll be a combination of using Site Improve, an automated tool, along with manual and functional testing. I'll explain what that means a little bit later this morning. Once we have done the audit, we're going to put a corrective action plan in place. With that, we'll be establishing the priority of what sites we should work on, and also roles and responsibility for actually doing the remediation work. Too early to say exactly how that process is going to play out, but right now, if you have responsibility for creating websites or maintaining websites, the responsibility would probably fall to you to make sure that we're in compliance to accessibility. We've never done UB or buffalo.edu centrally. It's a distributed model, so I expect the remediation also to be a distributed model. And one of the things to keep in mind is, for example, when we were looking at the audit over the summertime, I didn't try to remediate our Office of Student Accounts site, because I know that this year at some point it's being redesigned and going into the CMS. So it would be a bad use of university resources to spend time remediating a site right now that I know is going away. So those are the kinds of things to think about as you think about your remediation work. is your site being redesigned? Are parts of it going to go away? In fact, this is probably a very good time to think about, do you need everything on your website? If you have 1,000 pages on your website and 50 of them are being used, it's much easier to go back and use, remediate 50 pages than trying to do all 1,000 of those. So again, this will all kind of play out going over the next few months. I also want to mention real quick what is happening at the SUNY level. So last summertime, because so many SUNY campuses were receiving complaints from the OCR, a SUNY EIT, which is Educational Information Technology, is created a committee. So this is in response to campuses seeking guidance from SUNY administration about what they should be doing. So our hope is to provide a systematic approach to maintaining accessible web content. I'm on that committee, as are, I think, 3 or 4 other people from UB. There's about 25 people on this committee altogether. The ultimate goal is to create a SUNY-wide community of practice, especially when it comes to understanding what the OCR requirements are. One of the challenges of working with the Office of Civil Rights is that what they expect varies by the attorney involved and by the investigator involved. So I've talked with many of our SUNY colleagues, and what they're expected to do is different than what we're expected to do. So the more we can share best practices, I think the better off we're all going to be. So that's one of the goals of this committee. In November, there was a memo issued from the SUNY interim provost to campus leadership. Our campus did receive this, notifying them of the creation of this SUNY-wide committee and underscoring the importance of this committee. So again, I've been doing this a long time. This is the first time I have seen SUNY really take a vested, sincere interest in web accessibility. So that's actually good news as we think about what we can do across all of the campuses. In March, there will be a policy, a SUNY policy proposed to the SUNY Board of Trustees. No reason to think that won't be approved. I helped draft that policy, and it's in complete sync with what we're doing at UB, so we don't have to worry about that. The other thing that's happening right now is a series of subcommittees are being created and will be working throughout the spring. I am working on the Web Development Committee, and my main task over the next month or so is developing what we're calling a minimum web accessibility standard. For those of you who have spent any time looking at the WCAG 2.0 AA standards, it's very confusing. It is very difficult to understand. The goal of these minimum web accessibility standards is to write it in plain English in a way that everybody will understand, explaining why we need to do this particular thing, how to implement it, and how to test it. So again, I think it's going to be very valuable with our work. If anybody has spent any time on the WCAG site, that can be very confusing. This will be much easier, I hope, for everybody to understand. So before I go on, any questions, comments, concerns about the legal piece of this or what we're doing with the OCR agreement? Yep. Sure. So the plan, so two pieces to that answer. One is that SUNY is looking at setting something up actually in Facebook Workplace that will allow SUNY campuses to talk to each other about that. Internally for UB, we absolutely are going to set something up. In fact, if anybody has feedback about what that should be, whether it should be a listserv, whether it should be Yammer, whether it should be whatever it should be, we're open for conversation. We've talked about this internally a bit, and I think a listserv might be the easiest thing to do. As much as I personally hate listservs, that's what everybody else is more comfortable with. So there will absolutely be a way to communicate with not only what's going on, but actually asking each other questions so we can just kind of make this whole process easier. Yep. Absolutely.
If I'm developing something in-house for internal communications for a director's office, for example, all of the reports, Excel spreadsheets and things, do they have to?
Is it publicly available?
No.
Is it available to the entire UB community?
No.
Then we'll talk. So here's one of the challenges. So this is where I pretend I'm not a lawyer, so don't take this as legal advice, but kind of the interpretation, especially that we're following at the SUNY level. So this has been a big issue in terms of learning management systems. Think about the video that is available in most learning management systems and the thousands or tens of thousands of hours of video that might have to be captioned. That is a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of time. So the approach that's being taken for video, again, this is at the SUNY level, for video where you know it's a controlled audience and you know who that audience is, you need to provide a mechanism where if somebody has an accessibility issue, you can get them that information in an alternate format. So what you're describing, I think, would be the same thing. If you have a small committee where you're sharing documents on the web and there are 10 people who have access to that, and you know those 10 people don't have any issues with that, you don't have to necessarily go through and make all that information accessible. So does that make sense?
Bruce Jackson runs the Buffalo Film Seminar Series. He displays commercially available films. They're not all captioned.
Right, that actually is an interesting legal debate that we've been having. So think about this. So Bruce Jackson has videos that he shares as part of this that aren't his video. So from an intellectual property standpoint, he can't go and change those even if he wanted to. So if he's got those embedded on UB's website, it's a little bit different perhaps than if he's pointing to it on YouTube. So there's a little bit of nuance there, and I don't want to necessarily go down into that rabbit's hole, especially without legal counsel. But there are, we're getting into some of the finer pieces of this.
All right, upstairs in the library, we have DVDs that we borrow. Some are older, some are newer, some have captions, some don't.
Right. Or think about the biggest challenge for the libraries, which is course reserves. So we actually, as part of the SUNY committee, there is a separate subcommittee of people from libraries who are going to deal with all of those issues. So lots of interesting challenges. One of the things to remember is that the goal here is to make, our best face effort to make everything accessible, knowing, again, this is where I don't want this recorded, but I'm going to say it, that it's virtually impossible to make everything perfectly accessible. So we need to focus on the key sites for students. We need to focus on essential services. We need to have due diligence with how we spend university resources. And if there are situations where it is not cost effective to go and fix all of that, that's where that accessibility statement comes in. Making sure that we have a way to provide an alternate way to get at that information is really what all of this is about. So if somebody had an issue with a DVD that's not captioned, trying to go and caption those all ahead of time isn't a good use of university resources. But if somebody needs to do that, doing everything reasonably possible to accommodate that request is what we're shooting to do. Okay? Yep.
Are you looking for clients or students to take part in this that may have a disability?
Yes. So one of the things we're doing as part of the OCR agreement is we want to get feedback from the campus community. So two pieces to answer that question. One is that we're going to be putting together focus groups this springtime to talk about people's experience, people with disabilities, their experience with using our products, and Kim is actually the person to talk to about that. But when it comes to testing, and I'll get to that in a minute, the more resource we have with people's experience, especially using assistive technology, the better. So if you know of people who use assistive technology and are willing to share their experiences with us and perhaps even volunteer to help us test sites, that would be awesome. Yep.
Are there going to be any kind of consultation services available? One of the things we've been struggling with is getting guidance on our in-house cloud applications and accessible that are sort of embedded into the CMS.
Right. The answer to that is at some point down the road, yes. So right now, I can provide that kind of consulting, but my focus over the next couple of months needs to be on the audit. So we will certainly look at that. So as I look at how we provide advice, guidance, and training to the campus, I'm hoping that we can provide training materials that answer 95% of the questions. It's that other 5% that are more challenging and more unique, which is where having somebody who can come in and consult with that. So that's the model I hope we follow. We're not in a position right now to be able to do that, but it's certainly the hope down the road that we'll be able to do that. Yep.
So I'm with the Student Association, and we have several custom-built web applications. I think you answered it with the gentleman's question behind me, but we have administrative sides to the website that only certain are we also looking at all of those needing to be accessible or just the main?
I would, again, for now, I would focus on the publicly available student-facing websites. For anything that has a controlled audience, where you know who is accessing that information, making sure that if they have an issue, they can contact you is the much more cost-effective approach. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about making them accessible anyways. For a lot of legacy systems, that can be a challenge. So when you're thinking about accessibility from the start, it actually is not that hard. And I'm going to talk about that at the end. And the analogy is if you're building a 50-story skyscraper and you build that and don't put an elevator in, to go back and put an elevator in is a huge challenge. It may be impossible. If you know you're going to put an elevator in from the start, it's relatively easy to accommodate that, and that's the perfect analogy for the web, which is why I wanted to bring up this February 15th deadline. So going forward, if you're creating anything new, make sure you're thinking about the accessibility piece, because it will make life a lot easier. Yep.
Are there any strategies in place to kind of help compel third-party vendors that we're in contact with to
Yes. So this is probably the biggest challenge that any educational institution faces, that most of the third-party software, even though we have asked and said that as part of the RFP process it needs to be accessible, most of them are not. So procurement is a huge, huge issue, and I am happy to report that our procurement officer, our office here, is leading SUNY efforts. They are at the front of thinking about this. There has been a document called the VPAT, V-P-A-T, which is the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. Vendors are supposed to fill that out. The challenge for procurement is they don't have the technical expertise to call a vendor when they say they're doing something and they aren't. So VPAT's starting a month ago, I'm actually looking at now. So the big products, so I'm thinking about the Hub. I'm thinking about Blackboard. You know what, the Hub's not accessible. The OCR will say, you know what, that's our problem. I'm going to say to the OCR, and they're going to agree with this, is that we have relatively limited ability to change that, but the more we can force vendors, in fact, this is a conversation going on for anybody on the IT side with EDUCAUSE, where they're trying to put together a group that pushes back on Banner and PeopleSoft that you have to make this stuff accessible. I was very critical of Blackboard 5 years ago. They are actually doing a lot of great things with Blackboard. They understand that they need to do this. But another thing for all of you to keep in mind is that, so I'm talking about kind of enterprise-wide software that we may be involved with. A lot of you may be purchasing for $500 software that's going on your websites. That software needs to be accessible. So we're going to have to figure out a way to let, and that might be something, it might be below the threshold for procurement to be really involved with buying that. So understanding what some of these rules are, and as you're purchasing third-party software, you need to keep all of that in mind. All right, so lots of good questions. Happy to answer all of them, but let's move on. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about introductory training. So my goal here is not to have you have this be your be-all, end-all training, but as we're going through the audit, and there are things you can be thinking about and things you can be doing that you're going to have to do anyways and are relatively easy to implement. So these are some things you can be doing right now. So there's going to be 6 areas that we look at. Alternate text for images, video captions, links, headings, color, and keyboard access. So we're going to go over this real quickly. So alternative text is probably the #1 thing that people have thought about when it comes to making a site accessible. So what alternative text does is provide screen readers the content in place of images to make that image accessible. There is a kind of art and science to producing good alt tags. You need to understand the context of the image. In fact, you could have an image that should have different alt tags, alt text, depending on how that image is being used. So for example, if you had a photo site where you're demonstrating your photo gallery, you may have in your alt text, this picture was taken with this camera at this speed because it's describing what that image is, where that same image could be used as the portrait of the person it actually is. So the context is very important as you think about your alt text. Be succinct. Remember that screen readers are reading your alt text. So they don't want to listen to a 100-word description of what an image is if you can say that in 10 words. Don't use image of or picture of in your text because they know that's an image or a picture. And pictures that are purely decorative should use what's called null alt text, which is alt equals quote, quote, with no space in between. So what'll happen when you do that is assistive technology screen readers will never read that. So I want everybody to think about images on your website, especially your transactional websites, and whether they provide value or not. So put yourself in the place of somebody using assistive technology, and I'm just making this up, I don't know if this is true or not, but all they want to do is go and pay their bill. So if there's lots of pictures on that page with pretty girls sitting under trees, to use a phrase from my world, does that actually provide value with their goal of filling out that form? Perhaps that is just a decorative image. So we can talk about that, down the road about what that actually means. I am a big proponent of if that image doesn't provide real value, especially on transactional sites, use a null alt text. If you want more information about alt text or information about web accessibility in general, my favorite site is called WebAIM. The link at the bottom is the link to the information about alt text. When I was teaching that class I mentioned 10 years ago, all of my materials came from WebAIM. They do a really good job of explaining what needs to be done in layman's terms. So this is a really good resource for you to get more information about alt text. So let's move on to captions, specifically video captions. This is something that the OCR looked at and will continue to look at in great detail. Video is a great thing, a great medium. However, there are some things we need to be doing. We need to provide synchronized captions for all video. So that's whether the video's on YouTube, Vimeo, self-hosted, whatever it may be, we need to provide captions for those. Many of people use the auto captioning function of YouTube. That is a good start. However, it is not sufficient. Most of the studies I have seen is that the captioning on YouTube is 75 to 80% accurate. Sometimes the mistakes it makes are very embarrassing. My recommendation is right now, if you have a lot of YouTube video and you don't have the auto captioning turned on, turn it on. It is better than nothing. That being said, you're going to have to think about providing much better quality captions. So on that front, we have been doing our captionings in our office ourselves for a long, long time, but this is a huge area of concern, and there are a lot of companies popping up that provide this service very inexpensively. 3Play Media is a company that if you have lots of long, long videos, so this is more on the teaching side where you have every course, online, every course has been recorded and you need to caption all of that, a place like 3Play Media is where to go. If you have little short marketing videos that are 3 to 5 minutes long, Rev.com you can use right now. They charge like $1 a minute. So if you have a 5-minute video, it's going to cost you $5 to get that captioned. At the end of the day, that's a pretty good use of time and money. So one of the things that I want to say, and we are very early in these conversations, is this is something that SUNY is looking at. Can we get a SUNY-wide license for 3Play Media that brings that cost way down? So that's something we're not going to address until later in the summer probably, but know that we're kind of looking at enterprise, both at the UB level and the SUNY level, ways to do that. Some best practices for captioning. Use spacing, punctuation, and line breaks. If you want to know the value of that, go and look at some YouTube videos that are auto-captioned and there isn't any punctuation or line spacing. It is very difficult to follow what's going on. So punctuation makes a huge, huge difference. Put nonverbal sounds in parentheses or square brackets. Also, identify the speaker if the visual doesn't show who is actually speaking. So those are some quick best practices when you're thinking about your captioning. There was training done by Kathy Donnelly in my office last fall as part of the DCT. This is the link to that training. So she actually does a really good job of explaining some of the nuances about doing captioning right and the process that we provide as well. So if you want to know more about captioning, immediately, this is a really good resource for you. All right, let's move on and talk about links. So when it comes to links, again, this is something that's very high on the OCR radar. There are two things that you need to keep in mind. Links need to be descriptive and they need to be distinguishable. So by descriptive, that means that if I just look at the link, it's descriptive enough for me to know where that link is going to go. So things like click here, read more, see all are not descriptive enough in that context. And I'll show you an example why that matters in just a second. The second is that links need to be, so if you have a link that uses the word, I'll use the word admission, on a web page, and one link goes to the main admission site, and the other link that says admission goes to international admissions, that's what a non-distinguishable link would be called. So you need to make sure that if you're using the word admission, that link is always going to the same place off of that page. Okay, make sense? So why this matters, with assistive technology, one of the things that they do, people using that technology does all of the time is I want to see a list of all of the links. So this is actually taken from JAWS, and you can see that they have asked to show me all the links in tab order. So you see read more, 15 comments, read more, no idea. That becomes completely unusable to them because they have no idea where any of those links are going. The better method is that you use much more descriptive links. So services, news, resources about, that's a lot more descriptive so people know where they're going prior to clicking on that link. And by the way, that's a best usability practice as well. Because a lot of us, we scan the web. We're not looking at every single word. Links jump out at us. And if that's easy for us to kind of process, it just makes it easier for everybody involved. So that is something that the OCR definitely looks at. The good news is that SiteImprove does a really good job of identifying these issues, much better than Wave for anybody who's been using Wave. Next thing to think about are headings. So before I talk about headings, I want you to understand the concept of semantic markup. So as you're designing your web pages or designing documents that go on the web, it is important to convey information about the meaning of information rather than the presentation or look. All of us, myself included, make this mistake when we're creating Word documents. At least everybody I've come across. When I create a Word document, the heading, I go in, I make it bold, I make it 24 point, it's all about the visual. What I should be doing if I'm thinking semantically is going into Word and identifying that as being a heading. So when you're making web pages, it's the same thing. In HTML, there are 6 levels of headings, H1 through H6. That's what we should be using to help people parse information on web pages. So when it comes to your headings on your web pages, again, this is something the OCR flags very quickly. They need to be in order and not skip levels. So if you have an H1 followed by an H4 and it skipped those 2 levels, that is something that is a big error and something that the OCR will definitely look at. This becomes a huge challenge in any kind of content management system where content is being shared. So University Communications had done a great job working in the CMS to address a lot of these issues, but be aware that as you're looking at headings, they need to be in the right order and use them appropriately. Use them to describe, so people can navigate that page relatively easily. All pages should have an H1 heading. There is a lot of conversation right now whether multiple H1s are allowed. Technically, the letter of the law, you will not get flagged if you have multiple H1s on your page. There could be some SEO implications for doing that. It also, when you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense for somebody who's got a cognitive disability because they would think that there's an H1 and that's at the top, and if they see 20 H1s, it possibly could be confusing for them. But anyways, make sure that your pages at least have, minimally an H1 tag on it. This is why it matters because that WebAIM group that I mentioned before does surveys of assistive technology users. And in the last survey, 61% of screen readers reported that the very first thing they do when they come to a web page is scan the headings. So the vast majority of people using assistive technology, this is what they do, and this is what it looks like in headings. So you can, again, in assistive technology, either do it alphabetically or in tab order, show all headings or just a specific heading. But you want, this is actually an example of it done right, you want that going down in an order that makes sense. What happens is when you skip headings, again, we can see what's going on, but somebody using assistive technology, they're going to think to themselves, I just went from an H1 to an H4. Did I miss something? Because they can't see that. So that's why this is such an important thing for assistive technology. Next thing I want to talk about is color and color contrast. So one of the things to keep in mind is do not use color alone to convey information. So if you say, click on the red button or whatever, remember that color is a way to, distinguish information. That is a huge issue. Related to that is don't use directions. So I see this a lot where it says, click on this link in the left. Well, guess what? Somebody using assistive technology, there is no left. There may not be a left if you're on a mobile device, and all of a sudden that's been condensed and now is a single column. So be careful about not just using color, but using specific kind of references to place for things. The biggest thing in terms of color is providing enough contrast between the text and the background so it can be read by people with moderately low vision. This is, again, something that the OCR is really looking at closely. Even though it's just a, quote, just a AA standard, that's like one of the top 2 or 3 things that I have seen that they are looking at. There are a number of tools, depending on how much time we have, I can show you a couple of them to check the color contrast. But that being said, actually, let me just do this real quick. So if you have normal text, your contrast ratio needs to be 4.5 to 1. If you have large text, it needs to be 3 to 1. Their definition of large text is something that is 14-point bold or larger. So for any of you who have used a wave before as a way to check color contrast, be aware that it delivers a lot of false positives and a lot of false negatives. If you have anything where there are background images or background gradients, any automated tool is not going to find that. So this is something that you almost need to do a little bit of manual checking to make sure that you have the appropriate color contrast. Don't want to go into too much detail about that, but there are tools. As you're thinking to yourself, how am I going to check this? There are tools out there to do that. And by the way, SiteImprove does a great job of checking for these kinds of issues. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm relying on my UC friends. So the color palettes we've gone through and made sure those are all. Yeah.
Also, there's a discrepancy between print and web between points and pixels. So 14 points is 1 to 1, right? So 14 points on the web.
Right. And without going too far down in the weeds about this, depending on what typeface, what font you're using, it can vary quite a bit in terms of the size and how legible that is. So these are guidelines, but think about, can somebody go on your website and read that? Is it big enough? Is the contrast good enough to be able to read that? So, all right, next thing I want to talk about is keyboard accessibility. This is something that you are going to have to test on your own. No automated tool can check for all of these things. They can check for pieces of it, but they can't check for all of it. So the very first thing you want to provide is a way to skip repetitive navigation. So for anybody who has a site in the UBCMS, there is a skip links option. When you hit that tab key, that's usually the first or second thing you see. That's what we're talking about, a way to skip all of that repetitive navigation. Because if you think about it, the last thing somebody wants to do is listen to all of those links over and over and over again on every web page. So that's a definite requirement. All links need to be available using the keyboard. I've come across quite a few sites at UB where this is not possible. You cannot use the tab key and the keyboard to get to all of the links on your pages because of the way they were coded. That is a huge, huge issue, so that needs to be corrected. The tabbing order needs to be logical. So if you think about how people scan a web page, in most of the sites in the UBCMS, you have top-level tools, top-level navigation, perhaps left margin navigation, then the content, and then the page footer. That needs to be logical. It should not skip all over the place if you're hitting the tab key. In addition to that, what's called keyboard focus. So if I hit a tab key, there needs to be a way for me to know where I am on that screen. So it's been highlighted. So if I hit the enter key and actually want to open that link, I can see what's happening. So keyboard focus needs to be very visible. And then the final thing is that there are no keyboard traps. What I mean by that, if any of you have a Twitter widget on your website where you've actually embedded tweets onto your website, can you get out of that widget? Because what happens in most of those widgets, not all, but most of them, you start tabbing through your tweets, it never ends. You can't get out of it. Okay, so that's what's called a keyboard trap. I'm not going to pick on athletics, but if you want to go and see another example of this, go to the athletics main page. Not their fault. It's the company who created their site for them. They have stories on their front page that never stop scrolling. So with a keyboard, you can never get out of that. That's a keyboard trap. So that's keyboard accessibility. NoMouse.org. The No Mouse Challenge. There's actually some instructions on this page if you want to know more about the keyboard controls. I want to mention very quickly PDFs and other documents. I am not going to get into this in detail right now because we don't have time. We will do a specific session on PDFs and other documents. Last I checked, the best I can tell is UB has about 90,000 PDFs. I'm telling you that 89,500 of them at least are not accessible. Fixing them is a huge challenge. Here are some things to keep in mind when you're working with PDFs right now. Do you really even need it as a PDF? That's the first question to ask you. If you can do it in HTML, do it in HTML. So I'm not going to go through, I don't have time to go through the rest of this, but know that we will be addressing PDFs and other documents in a specific training session at some point soon. When it comes to testing, I need to kind of go through this pretty quickly. By the way, if you need to leave at 10, feel free to get up and leave at 10. This is probably going to take me probably 10 more minutes to get through. So when it comes to testing, there are three pieces that you use. The first are automated tools like SiteImprove and Wave. But when you are using automated tools, you need to keep in mind that even the best automated tool is only going to find 25 to 30% of your problems. Okay, so they are still really valuable, but they are not going to find everything. All because you go into Wave or go into SiteImprove and it comes back that you have 0 errors. That is 0 errors from an automated tool. It does not mean your site is fine. All of them will deliver very different results. So there's probably 25 or 30 tools out there you can use. All of them are a little bit different, which can be confusing. Third is a lot of them will deliver false positives. I talked before about color contrast. That's probably the biggest issue I see, where they will go and say that your site is fine with contrast, but in fact it's not, because the automated tool cannot see if you have a background image that may cause an issue with contrast. Again, still very valuable with large websites. There is no way we could find, so one of the things we can do with SiteImprove is across all million-plus pages at UB, find all the images that don't have an alt tag. So that's an extremely valuable thing to be able to do. So it will provide huge value for us, but don't rely on that just by itself. Second is manual testing. So we talked about keyboard testing before. Other things that you do manually is looking for other examples of non-distinguishable links. So if you have a page where the link is PDF, and that's what the actual title is, that's a non-distinguishable link. That can be a problem. So lots of things you do with manual testing. Checking for captions is something that has to be done manually. Even looking at the quality of an alt text is something that should be spot checked manually. An automated tool will tell you that it's an alt tag or an alt text. It won't tell you whether it's descriptive enough. In a lot of the old CMS systems, they actually put the file name in as the alt text. I'm not sure what value that provides, but check the box that this is accessible. In addition to the manual testing, we're going to do functional testing, which is actually using assistive technology to test the site. So the main screen readers are JAWS on the Windows side, VoiceOver on the Mac side. There's some other tools. We are going to be doing functional testing on the most important pieces of UB's web presence. This is a challenge because not only does every tool work a little bit differently, they all work different depending on what browser you're using and what operating system you're using. So the permutations get into the dozens very quickly in terms of how all of this works. So what we're going to do is choose the most common, screen readers. We'll use JAWS on the Windows side, and we'll probably use it with Chrome or Firefox, whatever the recommended one is, and that's what we're going to check with. We're certainly not going to have the time or the budget to go through and check every single permutation. And we'll be looking again at those essential service sites and those really high traffic sites when we do that functional testing. All right, we are not going to have time for a live demonstration. A couple things moving forward. As I mentioned before, we are going to do a lot of training as we move forward. More sessions like this, in-person training. One of the nice things about SiteImprove is they have online courses around accessibility. So we will be able to have all of you sign up and take that training, and we'll be able to demonstrate to the OCR how many people have actually taken that training. So they're actually developing a lot of new course material around accessibility. In addition to that, SUNY is looking at leveraging the resources that are available across all 64 of our campuses. Many of our campuses have great materials already around training about accessibility, especially on the teaching and learning side. So what we're going to do is make all of that available and not try to reinvent the wheel. And so there's going to be plenty of those kinds of materials available. We're also going to look at expanding what the information available on the UB accessibility site. If you have not seen this site before, that is where you will find it. And there is a section there on electronic accessibility. So there is some kind of general information about best practices, but as we go forward, the hope is that we'll add a lot more information to that site. All right, so I want to wrap this up with about 3 or 4 minutes as I'm going to get up on my soapbox and talk a little bit about how to think about accessibility. So when I go back to the definition I used at the beginning, this is about inclusive practice. And one of the things I love about working at UB is that we really, as a core principle, talk about inclusion and including everybody. And at its core, that's what accessibility is actually about. In fact, my favorite technical book about web accessibility is called Inclusive Design Patterns. So for any of my developer friends in the room who have not read this book, I would absolutely recommend reading this book. That's what this is about at the end of the day. I also think that there is too much emphasis on compliance and not enough focus on the user experience. This is why the functional testing is important. I can check a box off that says, you know what, this has an alt tag, but if it isn't a good alt tag, the user experience suffers. So here's one of my favorite examples from the physical world about when you're just checking off a box for standards. All right, that is a wheelchair ramp to get into this building. I'm not sure anyone would actually want to try to use that wheelchair ramp. Think about the user experience. Don't think about checking off the box. Another thing philosophically is the focus on usability for everyone rather than accessibility for a few. So again, this impacts way more people than most people think. At some point, you may break your arm and not be able to use a mouse. And if somebody designed a website where it works with a keyboard, you're going to be really thankful about that. My last kind of point is that we are all temporarily abled. My favorite project in my professional life was working with my daughter and a group of third graders to make a website accessible for a world-famous athlete who is legally blind. Her name is Rachel Skidoris. She ran in the Iditarod 10 years ago. She sued the Iditarod to let her run with a spotter in front of her because she's legally blind. And if you're familiar with the Iditarod, the last thing you want to do is be out where there's a 1,000-foot cliff off to your left and not know that because you're legally blind. So I'd be happy to share this story at a later date, but we actually had a group of third graders take her website. I taught them how to code. I taught them how to do everything from scratch. They made her website completely accessible. Her quote, because we Skyped with her all of the time during this project, the quote that stuck with me with Rachel was, "We are all temporarily abled." And as I am getting up in age now and my vision isn't what it used to be and my hearing isn't what it used to be, I'm starting to feel that firsthand. So with that, I thank you for your time. It is 10 after 5. I am happy to take and entertain any more questions. Yep. Yes, so this has been recorded and will be available on that accessibility site I mentioned at some point. Let me know if you want the slides quicker than that. I'm happy to share them. Yep. Any other questions? If not, I thank you for your time. I look forward to working with all of you going forward. Thanks.